Strive and Thrive is a collection of discussions featuring guests from various fields, focused on guiding entrepreneurs in creating businesses that excel in every aspect: people, planet, and profit. Throughout the series, you can join us, Romesh and Mike, as we explore relevant topics with our guests which can help businesses thrive.
Romesh and I met while I was supporting a client transforming their business, and I needed finance director support and reached out to him and his team. Since then, we've become good friends who share a passion for business and entrepreneurship. If you like today's discussion, then you want to subscribe to our YouTube and Spotify channels. Hi everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of Strive and Thrive. And today we have a guest, Jon Anthony. So welcome, Jon.
Hey, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Romesh. I'm really pleased to be here.
Great.
This is going to be fun.
Great to have you on. Great to have you on board. So I'll do a quick introduction, Jon, and then let you do the better one. But Jon is one of the most interesting, technical, and purposeful founders I've had the pleasure of working with over the last 4 or 5 years since I've known him. Jon and I have discussed all sorts of ideas on technology, AI particularly, but also innovation potential and possibilities. And I find collaborating with him so interesting. On the pre-warm-up for this call, I think we went through about 20 ideas in half an hour, and that perhaps sums up the nature of Jon, our conversations and what we do. So it's super interesting. But I'm also interested in learning on this call about Jon's experience and what motivated him to become an entrepreneur and how he has built up Adapt to the success it is today. So Jon, thanks for joining us. And could you give us that 1-minute journey for yourself on how you've got to where you are today?
1 minute, of course. So thanks, Mike. And look, I'm going to start by saying, like, Mike's a really good friend as well as somebody that I worked with. I think, one of the first projects that we collaborated on ended up with us getting an award from the Home Office. At the time, I think we were working on the EncroChat project. And Mike and I have always swapped good ideas and had a lot of fun. The company Adapt, which I am the founder of, along with JJ, who's my original co-founder, who behind the scenes makes everything work. We started in 2011. Last payroll, we were 220, I think, people. And fundamentally, it's a company of geeks. It's grown, it grows every year. It grows relatively organically. We probably could be a little bit more structured, but we have a lot of fun on the way as well.
Brilliant. Jon, thank you so much. And we're really excited to have you on board. I've had the pleasure of speaking to you a couple of times, as we've prepared for today's discussion. And I'd like to start by going back a bit in time, if that's okay, because I think you've got a really interesting story, your personal journey to becoming an entrepreneur. Can you tell us about your background and maybe some of the motivations for you to try and be successful as an individual?
Yeah, definitely. Look, for me, I think it's a case of what's possible. There's a great theory out there, which is like 10,000 hours worth of hard work in any subject makes you an expert. I don't know if anybody watches the Matt Armstrong Hard Work Beats Talent YouTube cast that he does where he fixes cars. But it's that principle that if you work hard, you can be successful. How did it start? For me, going back, and look, I was born at the beginning of the 70s, so I'm really old, like 1970. We didn't have gas fires when I was born. We had coal fires. And that's true, for real. I remember the excitement when we got our first gas fire. We're like, wow, look at this new technology. That was higher technology then. And I, pretty poor parents. No degrees in our family, like literally a hole in the roof. But parents worked incredibly hard, and I was behind. I was behind my younger sister at school. And then one day the psychologist diagnosed me as being hyperactive, years before ADHD, and said, you probably could get him to be successful, but you need to relook at how he learns, which was good because it was horrible being 2 years behind my sister. And they basically said, look, he's probably bored. and as I grew, and probably around about 8 or 9 years old, and I was set to go. So this was South Manchester in a place called Chorlton, catching the bus. And I looked out, and there were people in the school uniform of the school that I was going to next, which was quite excited. And then I looked out at the window and saw what was actually going on, and it wasn't exciting. It was horrific. They were holding a boy down and they were taking running kicks at his head. Before mobile phones, before anything, told the bus driver, but I was on the top floor. By the time I got down, we'd way past the scene. And it scared the living daylights out of me. And from that point, I was determined not to go to the comprehensive. So I studied really hard. My only real option then was to pass the entrance exams and get a bursary or a scholarship to a school like Manchester Grammar. And I was lucky. I did it. It worked. It was enough of a shock to the system for me to decide I don't want to do this. I'll do something different. So then became the poorest person at Manchester Grammar School, which was also interesting.
How did you cope?
So interestingly, Manchester Grammar, I remember the teacher stood me up at the end of the first year and went, "These are Jon's grades." And it was like E-, E5. I think E was your technical and 5 was how much effort they thought you put into it. And it was like E5, D4, C3. And literally over the course of an entire year, I got to A2 or A1. And I think it was I didn't understand the culture. I did not understand how to work in that environment. Got picked on quite a bit, really, just because I didn't fit in. And then by the second year, I unlocked it and I'd figured it out and had a gang of friends and didn't get picked on and started to have a lot more fun. But you work it out. Kids work it out.
Yeah, you adapted, which is the right term, I think. And wow, how incredible that you were behind in your studies and a seminal moment that you observed kind of drove you and spurred you on to actually achieve incredible potential. And what was your degree?
So my degree was physics, specializing nuclear physics and electronics, and my goal was to figure out nuclear fusion. So I had it all mapped out. It's interesting. I think at school, everybody decided being an actuary and working out accountancy numbers was the most lucrative thing anybody could ever do at that point. And it was kind of slightly before the stock market had really taken off. And then as I got there, I thought, well, that's boring. Let's do something fun. Nuclear fusion, that's doable. And Daresbury was, making great headlines at the time. And just as I was in my final year, all of the funding got cut to Daresbury, and basically the UK turned off its nuclear fusion funding program.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's in the Hartree Centre, and it's still there. And I know years later, I kind of got to visit Daresbury and Hartree and have a look around at what they're doing. But they're doing quantum computers now and other fun things. But that whole funding block is a shame, really. To be honest, there were a lot of people that believed it could have been unlocked in the 90s if we'd have kept at it.
Gosh.
Interesting. They're getting back into it now, aren't they?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Now it's back.
Yeah. With a vengeance, right? I mean, I wanted to talk about your degree because I think that journey, that personal journey you've been on, is incredibly inspiring, and what you've achieved in that sense is incredible. So tell us about the next leg of your personal journey. So you were a nuclear graduate, or in nuclear science and electronics, and how did you evolve that to become an entrepreneur?
So like most things, it's out of necessity. So I was working as a sound engineer part-time, earning a bit of extra cash at uni, and I was building amplifiers and electronics. So the electronics was working really well. Then my father at the time was supplying televisions for special effects at the Hacienda nightclub. And he had this idea. He basically said, look, there's a real problem here with forged banknotes. Can you do something? So I went, yeah, probably. So got a laser diode and some op amps, and we played around and we started measuring. So one thing they were getting wrong with the forgeries was that the metal strip was inconsistent, because who cared? Just, is it a strip? Is it a strip? Yeah. So we started measuring that with a really fine tolerance, and we were able to detect forgeries with complete accuracy. So we made this forged banknote detector and ran that as a business, and that was going quite well. And then the IRA peace agreement happened, and overnight all of the forgeries dried up. A couple of other changes, and then that business that was ticking over quite nicely. And this happens in business. The world changes. I think one thing, if you're ever going to set up your own company in technology, be prepared for technology to move. And you know, that shifted. But for me, that was my first time to learn that lesson, and it was kind of a hard lesson to learn. So from having a business that was working, we went to the market drying up. At that time, I was living in Birmingham because that's where I'd done my degree. Had a motorbike, £300 in the bank. Decided not to stay in Birmingham. I had some friends that were moving to London to do a university course, and I kind of said, "Can I come and join you?" And they were like, "Yeah, of course." I got a flat with them. Got the first job that I could, which was selling advertising. You know, in the 90s, particularly around that time, and you know what, I bet if I talk to graduates here, it's the same. Jobs doing what you wanted to do were not easy to find. Jobs selling advertising, if you could talk, were relatively easy to find. And if you weren't any good, they fired you 3 weeks later. So they would always take you. They just wouldn't necessarily keep you. And I got lucky. I ended up selling advertising in a European government journal, and I didn't really realize this. But I look back on it and think, yeah, that was probably shady, because a guy came in with a suitcase, handcuffed to his arm, and paid us in cash at the end of the week for a start. So we were there. That's for real. We were there, and it was a great experience. I learned an awful lot. But then the next job I got, which matched my skill set, was selling advertising on Electronics Times. So that was a lot more fun and suited me, and I was there. And again, that was one of those things where I didn't do very well at it to start with. And my boss was brilliant. I kind of had got this whole spiel that I'd learned from my previous company about, we've done this piece of research on your company and your sector. We talk all the way through it. And it was rubbish, you know, and it was how I'd been taught, was just to bluff your way through it. And my boss at the time said, "Why are you doing that? Why not just be honest? You know, tell people that you're new on the job, say that, you know, this is what we can offer, this is what we've got, see that you're advertising Electronics Weekly, would you consider doing a run with us?" And I tried it and it worked. I was like, wow, okay, that's a revelation, you know. And especially telling people, you know, when I was new, I would tell people I was new and they were helpful. So all of a sudden, you suddenly realize that people buy from people. They don't buy from rubbish. And so and people buy on trust, and then you really realize the value of trust. So a couple of other things happened, because I still wasn't the best salesperson on the floor. But I thought about things quite hard. So I changed my entire, so we used to sell 6-week and 12-week and sometimes a whole year series if we were lucky. And I'd missed the end of the year because I started in the new year. So I'd missed the closing to be able to buck in people's budget. So I did something different, which is I would get on the phone and say, "Do you know what? I'll sell you my lowest rate." And my lowest rate was sort of £11 a column centimetre versus £25. And I was allowed to go down that. I'd say, "Look, I'll sell you my lowest rate if you'll do a until cancel booking with me. And look, you need to give it like 6 weeks for it to work. And if it's not working after 6 weeks, cancel, but give me 3 weeks notice so I can get somebody else to fill your slot." What happened was nobody ever cancelled. So my revenue, which had been diving off a cliff, and you know, seats disappear every week. Somebody gets, you know, the lowest person on that floor would get fired. So as my revenue was going down, I was getting quite scared. And I came up with this idea and it started picking up. And then one day I kind of got back to where the person who used to own my seat had been sitting, but nobody cancelled, and it just kept going up and up and up. So then I was taking extra pages, way more pages than the previous person. At the end of when the results came out, I was number 2 on the floor out of 50 odd people. Number 1 is currently our CEO, who's David Larner. So he was the one person ahead of me. And
Is that where you met David from?
Yeah, that's where I met David. We were on the same floor together. Sorry, go on.
The interesting thing for me about this story, Jon, is how, firstly, I think of you as very technical, because that's the Jon I know. But do you think that learning gave you grounding in sales for a start, which is an important part of being an entrepreneur, but also your kind of aptitude for problem solving?
Definitely both. I think trust is the huge thing. Like, all those people that I sold to will still take a call from me.
Amazing.
It was pivotal. This guy called Tony Burklaff was my boss at the time, and he sat next to me and listened to me do a few calls, which is always scary when you're on sales. And he was so nice about it. And he just said, look, what are you doing? Listen to me. And then he picked up the phone and he did it his way. But I understood the intent of what he was trying to tell me. That for me was the big change. Understanding that people buy off people and just the value of trust as currency. When you get that, sales falls into place because, there's that, you talk about salespeople who can sell sand to Eskimos. No, got that the wrong way around, haven't I? You can sell ice to Eskimos, but actually, you want to be selling.
That works better, I think.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. You want to sell ice to people in the hot countries and sand to people in the countries that need sand. So that was the bit that I really learned. Was it's not about having the gift of the gab. It's about being solution sales. Like if you look at what we do, and like Mike, I should put you on the spot. Give me some examples. We solution sell. You don't go in there with a solution ready for somebody. We have the luxury of going in there and going, what is it that you need? And very, very frequently, if we can't do it, I will say, we're probably not the right. I have absolutely no fear in saying that we're probably not the right outfit for you. We're probably not, because this isn't what we specialize in, or I'll get very enthusiastic and go, do you know what? We can do this really well. And look, here are some examples. I'll spin it back to you, Mike, but I'm sure you've got examples of that.
Yeah, honestly, same thing, really. And I know Romesh and I talk a lot to other founders about this. Sales is scary for a lot of early entrepreneurs, particularly, and in my lens, Jon, and I've got a very different lens of you now in the last 5 minutes, but it's that whole, how do you do sales? And when you're a technical entrepreneur or a business entrepreneur rather than a sales-led entrepreneur, if you see what I mean, it's a scary learning curve. And I think knowing that it's orientating towards problem addressing and working with individuals and building trust and relationships, that for me is the way that it works generally. And I think when I set up Easel, I had to go on that journey myself, and retrospectively, to be honest, I had to learn about sales. I didn't have that grounding you had in the first place. So for me, I had to go, hang on a minute, I've got to do sales. What is sales? What does it mean? And I think that's quite an interesting retrospective for me in terms of becoming an entrepreneur and learning it. It's interesting that you actually, by coincidence, had that grounding, but you found yourself in a more technical, natural problem solving space, which is where you've built Adapt.
Yeah, and look, how lucky is that? So a lot of things happen in life and we think this is terrible, but actually those things in life make us what we are, and we learn from those experiences. So,
interesting.
Would I have learned this if the forgeries hadn't dried up? Probably not. Would have been in a very different place today. And so the things in life at the time that you think are not great sometimes turn out to be pretty good.
I love that that you basically came to the understanding that you needed to understand your customer and understand what they needed. And so you kind of went on a listening journey, really, which is so important, isn't it? And you really, really got that meaningful relationships are key. and that's brilliant. You know, I think what a great grounding. And Jon, you've mentioned your big break in IT previously. Is this the story that was your big break, or was that something else on your journey?
So big break happened for me next. So I look at my life and been pretty lucky. So late 90s, I switched over. So because I'd done really well, all of a sudden the headhunters wanted me, which was great. And the sales industry is quite promiscuous, and information gets around quite well, and success can breed success, which is lovely when it happens. And so I got headhunted for a broadcast company that made special effects equipment, that did Doctor Who and all sorts of
wow, that's
really
cool.
clever tech. And I loved it, and I was in there, and I was like, oh, I think I want to be an engineer now. And they were like, well, we've hired you to be a salesperson. So okay, fair enough. And they sent me around the world every couple of weeks. I was in Australia, Korea, Tokyo, America, flying around the world, demoing this special kit. I remember one of the best trips I ever did was they sent me to South Africa, and it was my first big major trip, and they were lovely. And they were like, look, do you know what? You're over in South Africa. If you want to stay out an extra couple, if you want to be out there for an extra week, so you can be out there for a couple of weeks and really enjoy it, you can do. And I was like, oh, yes, please. And I remember being invited to an all-night party, and just, it was so lovely because the weather was perfect, the people were perfect. And it was interesting. It was at the time, apartheid had fallen apart, but it was with a generation that I don't even think was that aware of it. It was a completely mixed culture party. Everybody was just chilling. And again, my great-grandmother was Black South African, and my great-grandfather was white South African. So there was always a bit of interest in Johannesburg, which is where I ended up being. But when we got out there, somebody had stolen all of the copper telephone lines to the new exhibition centre, because these things happen, which was difficult. So I got out there, and there was no easy way to contact back to base. So out there, mobile phone calls were a stupid amount of money. I could get a text message through, and that was probably costing £4 or something stupid. So comms were at a minimum, but the equipment had arrived on a ship, and it was smashed to pieces. Unfortunately, somebody a lot richer than me lent me their mobile phone, and I sat there with a soldering iron and repaired all of the kit and the guidance. And apparently the phone bill for that was something like £5,000. And I was like, what do you want from this? Let me organize. He was like, just buy me a slap-up meal. And I bought him a slap-up meal, and he bought a steak, which was about that thick, literally. And he was like, look, it's fine, don't worry about it. And we had a brilliant exhibition. But from there, I then got a chance to be an engineer in a broadcast company called TSI. And worked on loads of projects, pioneered all sorts of stuff, worked on lots of BBC stuff. And I started as a junior engineer, and then very rapidly became a senior engineer. And that was my big break. So I'd been looking after the IT system. And one day, I think it was the I Love You virus, we got infected with a virus, and it was a script virus. And somebody opened something, and it went all the way around the company via email and infected everybody. And our IT support company at the time didn't have a clue what to do. So I took the virus and rewrote it to go and reinfect and fix all of the registry entries, and then block out the other virus. And then I launched that, emailed it to everybody, fixed it, distributed it, got the company back on its feet. So that was a good day. That evening, we were having a company bowling night, and the directors of the company, and I'm not very good at bowling, but on that night, I'd scored 170 because I think I was just so amped up on adrenaline. I'll be in the 90s. But literally everything that I bowled was something magic kind of happened on that day. Probably an awful lot of adrenaline. And
you were in the zone. You're in the zone.
really. And the directors came over and said, "Do you want to be head of IT?" And I said, "Yes, please." So the next day I was head of IT. And that just kind of started on my path then from being, managed to senior management. So that was my big break. It was right place, right time, prepared to stick my neck out and say, I can fix this.
Brilliant. And obviously a key takeaway is to improve your bowling skills, right?
Yeah, that was good. Well, no, because it didn't stick.
A one-off.
Yeah.
That's fate, isn't it? Serendipitous. One evening of good bowling.
Yeah. Kind of that. The bowling was probably part of it, because it ended up with me being able to sit around and chat with the directors and look cool. I know they just kind of looked at each other, and there was clearly something going on. And then, there was just this conversation. Would you like to be?
So you've obviously always found your opportunities, Jon, shaped a problem, gone after it, fixed it. What was the point you went with Adapt then? Because you built it up as a big business now. But what was the point where you went, I want to do this on my own? Or was there a point you wanted to do it on your own?
Yeah, so JJ and I used to work a lot together. And I got to the point where I was building broadcast centers. And used to build these huge broadcast centers and put channels on air, and even a channel that I'd come up with somebody called Fleur Hicks, and we'd come up with this idea of doing X League, which was an esports channel on Sky. JJ had been somebody that had helped me put together a lot of the back end software, and JJ had worked on MHEC systems for Canadian broadcast as well. And we just said, you know what, we've made a lot of people quite rich. We should get together and do this for ourselves. And we go to lunch a lot, and we decided that we would. So in 2011, we went for it. I'd saved up enough money to be able to live for a year. JJ kept working, and the company didn't really earn enough money to pay me a salary until I think we started in June, and probably around about the next May, the company was able to give me a first initial tiny salary, which is brave. So why? I think the bigger story really is because I think we are naturally a country of entrepreneurs. We do have that entrepreneurial spirit, and we don't necessarily want to discuss Margaret Thatcher, but one of the things that she said was that we're a nation of shopkeepers. And I think you have to read into that what she meant, which is we are a nation of entrepreneurs. We are a nation of people that like to run our own small businesses and run our own small kingdoms. And so we set up the company, and it was the neighbor over the road that was the turning point for me. So I was terrified. I kind of felt that I probably should have set up a company a long time ago. I'd had my opportunities, but, we had a young baby, and I was too scared, and a mortgage, and I was too scared to put any of that at risk. And the neighbor over the road, who was a guy called Chris, who runs a very successful building company, and I looked at him driving around in his brand new flashy Mercedes and all of his other, and his beautiful house. And I was like, do you know what? How did you do it? How did you make that switch to running your own business? And he said, I used to be a black cab driver, and even when I, needed to put down a deposit for the house, he said, I really hate black cabbying, but, I worked 18 hours a day. Louise, my wife, said, go away and come back when you've got the deposit. And so I did. I think that might be mischaracterizing Lou, who's lovely. But, he was able to do that by putting in those 18-hour days and to get there. And he said, when I started the building company, I knew that even though I hate it, if it doesn't go wrong or if I'm in trouble, I can go back to cabbying. I've got that safety net. And I thought, what's my comparable safety net? And at the time, I can code, I can project manage, I can technical architect, I will freelance. And there's a good freelance market. And I know the freelance recruiters because I've been using them to get resource for my projects. So it was a case of, look, if it goes wrong, I'll freelance. So I have some sort of safety net in mind. And I never needed to freelance, and he never needed to drive a black cab again. But I'm sharing this because I think there are a lot of people out there who would like to start their own businesses. And for me, this was an unlock. This was when I could put that foundation block in place. Mentally, I was able to do it. Other things are a given. You have to save enough money to be able to live on, which means you've got a certain amount of drive. You have to have a certain attitude to money. So I've been very lucky. And again, this will be an interesting comparison, but I worked for Richard Desmond, Northern and Shell. He had two MDs, Martin and Stan. Stan was this great salesperson, and Martin was the negative end of the battery, and he ran procurement. And I learned from him how he watched the pennies. And it's a great story about Richard in a board meeting where somebody said, look, it's only £5,000. And Richard walked over and said, give me your wallet, and took out all his money, which was £50, and said, it's only £50, but now it's mine. Put it in his pocket, sat down. That was the end of it. He never gave it back either. It's that attitude of being careful with cash. And so you grow that attitude and you're able to start with lean beginnings. But I think the companies that can survive the lean times, because the world is cyclical, do well.
And did you ever have a plan, Jon? Because the way you've articulated this conversation so far is beautiful, but it's demonstrated through life's experiences and sets of events that have created triggers that have moved you in a direction, almost like there was no plan. But did you have a plan for Adapt? Did you have a vision, or did you just go we're going to do this, and we kind of know the areas we can play in?
So, to be honest, I love to say we had a plan, but it was a leap of faith. It was like, I backed myself. Johnny May, one of my favorite English wingers, really, really good. And he said something which really resonates with me. When somebody said, what's going on in your mind when you're chasing after that ball and you've got other members of your team who are also putting their hands up saying, I can do it. And you've got an opposition charging towards you. And he said, I always back myself to win. And I've got a little bit of that. Like, I do have that self-belief that I will make it work. And Johnny May has that. He typifies it, which he goes for it. You don't think twice. It's a rock climbing thing. It's that really difficult wet climb that I did over winter where it went dark and the rain was chucking it down and everything changed in a flash. And because it was raining, it was taking us a lot longer to get up, which meant it went dark. And if you worry about it, it's a struggle. So you get out of your head and go, do you know what? I can climb this, and you do it. And it's the same in business. You have that belief and you go forward and you adapt. What it's meant for me is I often bite off, you know me, right? If it's cutting edge, if it's bleeding edge, I don't like the idea of bleeding edge. As far as I'm concerned, we should be innovating. We should always be at the bleeding edge, and bleeding edge is positioned as being this scary place. And the very first project I ever built for the World Health Organization was called the Event Information System. And I was just out there just to do a proof of concept and just to help them. But I actually wrote a functional system in the 15 days that I was out there. And then that meant that we got contracted as part of the main build. And that really sprungboard our entire journey with the World Health Organization. I think we've built 40, 50 big platforms for them since then. But at the time... Yeah.
Can I pause you there, Jon? Because I do want to dig it. I do want to dig into the World Health Organization. But before we do, Romesh, any thoughts on what Jon's saying? Because he's reflecting on the journey we see a lot on Strive and Thrive, right? Of people taking through experience, but learning very quickly on what needs to be done. Do you have any views?
Oh yeah, Jon, there's a lot of stuff that just resonates. It's great to hear. I'm an economist, right? So your point about cyclicality, I think it's a really important point, that businesses that can survive the leaner times will do great when things turn around. And I think that's particularly relevant because it's tough times at the moment for lots of businesses. So yeah, I think that's particularly powerful. I love to hear about your will to win, and you need that, don't you? If you're going to drive your business forwards, you're taking risks, and you've mitigated those risks, haven't you, by having that backstop, that you could do something else, not necessarily something you really wanted to do, but that kind of fallback. just in case. And that was good to know. And I've kind of done that myself, with when I started my business. I had some really good advice at the start, which was, look, your business will take time to earn the kind of money that you might have enjoyed when you were a full-time employee. And so, interesting, you said it took about, almost a year for you to start drawing a salary, and that's risk taking, isn't it? But you built up a bit of a buffer, and you had a backstop just in case, and that gave you, in coupled with your will to win, some real confidence. I really enjoyed listening to that. Mike, when you kind of moved from employment to setting up your own business, were there elements that resonate with you?
Yeah, I like listening to Jon because he tells very clear stories where there's almost trigger points of learning that have given him big impetus. I don't know if I think like that, but if now I'm listening to Jon, I'm like, yeah, I can think of those events during my career that's led to me. I'm a lot later than you in terms of making the entrepreneurship jump, Jon. I was nervous, really cautious, had hundreds of ideas. You know me, I'm an ideas person, but I really took me a long time to make that leap of faith. And I didn't have those opportunities or trigger points and wasn't mature enough to think this is your chance, go for it. And I was very risk averse when I started. I had a very clear plan. I had 2 years. I knew exactly what I was going to do in my budget. I knew how it was going to work. But in some ways that constrained me because it didn't allow me to go for my big vision or the big things I wanted to start doing. And actually it was doing those 2 years allowed me to let my barriers down a bit and be a bit more relaxed and be a bit more confident in the ideas and going after the things that are more interesting for me and the world I want to play in. And I think my regret was not being more confident in myself earlier to really go for it.
Okay, let me put this to you then. So it's interesting. You look at your heroes in life and you look at your anti-heroes in life, and you learn equally from both of them. And Richard Branson has some incredibly interesting stories, particularly there's a story of him taking a decision to swim for shore, which saved his life, and probably should go read his biography because I don't want to spoil it, but it's really worth reading his first autobiography for that. And then you have anti-heroes. So let me be controversial, probably as somebody that manages people, and so look, how do you feel about the idea that you control your own destiny and run your own business versus going back and working for somebody else again? But I want to put it into these terms. My anti-hero is Alan Sugar. He is one of the people that I most despise in the public world of business. And let's be honest, I don't really hold back on my opinions on many things because of the way he treats people. And he was, for me, is a model of how not to manage people, how not to treat employees, and how in actual fact you can get the best out of people by really working with them and looking after them. So for me, there was a big point to prove as well, which as you grow up and you go through the world, you see good bosses and you see bad bosses, and you decide what kind of boss you want to be. And are you the sort of leader that people will follow into battle? And you don't really find that out until you go into battle and you have the people who are around you. Last week, we had an issue where Azure misinterpreted one of our database scale instructions from Terraform. Now, Azure have their own ARM format, but we use Terraform because it's a lot of people like Terraform because it's cross-platform for deploying infrastructure. Azure went, oh, you need to change this database memory size, but our database instance doesn't do that. We'll be really helpful. We're going to create you a brand new database. And it created a brand new database instance with the same name in the same place as the old one, which also was our reference to get to the backups, which meant that the database was suddenly empty and all the backups were inaccessible. Wow. Now, that wasn't easy to solve in the end. And there was nothing in the user interface to solve that because there was no old database. When we went to the database to go to the backups weren't there because it recreated it from scratch. we managed to find some snippets out there and get into command line. And before we did any damage, we managed to roll that back on a command line. And it was a really high level of knowledge. It was all fine. It would have been a messy scenario. And the first thing we did was tell the client exactly what had happened. And the client was lovely. And we said, we will get this back, but this could be painful. And we set expectations of it taking a whole weekend. Because even though this is a huge client, Microsoft support is notoriously slow, but we managed to get in and get Azure to reverse this decision and give us a restore where we could take the database and reinstall it and get back on our feet. One of the most fun, one of the most exciting, one of the best environments, with the entire team working together to find, probably 10, 11 people on a phone call, working out how we were going to solve this, people hedging the bets, some people restoring, some people rebuilding bits from tests, some people trying to get at the backups, but our backups were 2 weeks out of date. We didn't want to fall back to cold archive. That would have been a mess as well for what we were doing, because we need to do a degree of deduping. To lose 2 weeks of data would have been hideous.
But it was the team, right? The team dynamics and the team behavior.
It's brilliant. You have the best time when your back's against the wall. When you've got a team that all works together, it's the nicest feeling in the world. So Alan Sugar pits people against each other. And I've seen that in a lot of business models. It's definitely not ours.
You're really talking about zero sum versus win-win, aren't you? And I totally agree. Yeah, I think win-win is so much more powerful, and that's a really good example, actually. Yeah, going into battle with your team.
I wouldn't trust a single person that won The Apprentice, because you've seen how they got there. Would I do business with them? No. Would you? I don't know. Up to you. I'm tempted to say your funeral, but would you do business with somebody that you had already seen to be that Machiavellian?
I do think it's one of the challenges of many founders, in that founders do everything at first within their business, and they are doing the banking, the sales, the development, the customer service, everything. And actually, one of the challenges to then work out that you're better off having a team to do this, but actually let it go and let the team go. And that enables the team to succeed and work with them more collaboratively. And one of the challenges, we saw a lot of it from mentors who've come on here. They're like helping the founder find out what they're excellent at and enabling a team to do the rest. And it's those that don't let that happen are the ones who struggle to grow. It's the Alan Sugar analogy that you've just given us there. It's really letting the team succeed enables you to build a business that can grow and allow you to grow as a founder as well.
It's also the perception of fairness. So how do you have so for us, there was a very clear vision that we would have a meritocracy. Very early on, we had a young mum who was promoted to the board. We've got a board member who became a board member at the age of 22. Genius, absolute technical genius, who we took from school and started working with us at the age of 16, 17. Just didn't get on at school, but and that person started as an official apprentice. How do you let people rise to the surface? How do you create an environment? So exactly what you're talking about there, Mike. How do you create an environment where people will thrive?
Yeah, that's the magic. That's the magic explanation. And Jon, we've not got long left, and what I want to do is touch on technology, because I know that's the bit that's you and I have talked about. I think you've given us loads of good stuff on entrepreneurship. I just want to have a bit of time on technology. Could you tell us a little bit about what you do at the World Health Organization? Because I think that is such an interesting case study, or as far as you can explain what you did, but it's such an interesting use case of technology and its potential, because I'd like to explore that a bit further with you, and then where you think AI is going.
Absolutely. So the World Health have been on an incredible journey. When the chat models first broke through, they very wisely put a moratorium on using AI in the organization. And I understand why, and it was the right call. And then we were pretty lucky. We were the first organization that was allowed to use AI. and we did it in a very, very careful way with a lot of work on explainability. Now, every department, everybody's using AI, and that's history, but it's you get over your fears, but just because you have fears doesn't mean those fears are wrong. It means you figure it out. And so a lot of the things that we're doing right now, we're creating agentic flows to do things that humans could do if you had enough humans. And it's often if you look at, particularly, let's start with language models. Language models are next word predictors. So if I said Mary had a little, you would say lamb. And then if I said Mary had a little lamb, you say it, and then you say fleece. And so language models aren't intrinsically intelligent. They're next word predictors. Stick that in the back of your mind because it comes in useful. So now we have a way of interpreting language, which means that we can tie together technology and language together, which gets us to where we want to be an awful lot more quickly. And a lot of what we're doing is working with language. We're either verbally communicating or written communicating. So all of our information that flows around, and people talk about AI inventing its own language. It doesn't need to invent its own language. The way that we use AI right now, we've trained it on the languages that we use, and they work for sharing information. Now we're training on a corpus of information. So we're training the models to learn as much as we can possibly give them about human information, and that's created a natural soft ceiling. But if you have a language model that knows everything that we all know, it's now more intelligent than any one of us, which is good. Well, what you're seeing with language models is that to do that, initially, we had to create these frontier models that were enormous. What's actually happening now, because even the frontier models are starting to converge slowly, the smaller models are catching up as well, as we're getting much better at training these models. So now we have these models which can give us answers to questions. So the next thing to do is think, how do I get the best out of these models? And so what's interesting is, our CISO has the language model always called me darling. We can go into that, that's hilarious. But there are people that threaten the language models. There are people that say that this is very important to us. But as a next word predictor, if I tell you that this is incredibly important to me, it matters a lot that we do a good job here, that next word predictor gives you a better quality of answer than if you don't bother to tell it that. So what I'm trying to say here now is that, okay, I've just explained why it's not a person and why we shouldn't anthropomorphize it. But now actually, one of the best ways to get results out of these models is to start treating them like people, because fundamentally, now you're spinning forwards from personality that you've created. So if you are a nuclear physicist, if these are your characteristic traits, if this is what we want from you, if that goes into the model, we start getting a better quality of answer. And then what we start to do is string these agents together and these personas together and give them tasks to do and put them into an agentic flow.
Can I reflect back on what you've just said and check I understand? So it narrates to me. So you don't believe they're not intelligent, but you believe we should deal with them as if they are human responses, and therefore that's the better way of engaging with them. Is that my interpretation of what you've just said?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Does that lead to a more powerful outcome? Is that the end?
Significantly more powerful. Okay, I've got you three options. You tell the language model, I don't really care about the answer here, but give me your summary of this report. Give me your summary of this report, or this report is incredibly important for us, and accuracy is key. We can't afford to make any mistakes. Please give me a summary of this report, which is going to get you the best answer. Even as a next word predictor, you get the best answer where you specify the importance and the reason why. And so it's easiest just to think of treating them as you would treat a person. And once you start doing that, and we're looking at AI transformation, digital transformation, it actually makes it easier to put the blocks in place. So we have systems for the World Health Organization that are clustering diseases together. We have systems that are running small newsrooms where traditionally we might have had a team of 10 people. Now we've got the equivalent of Apple or BBC News that's being created on the fly with agentic flows. But the components of that, very frequently, we're treating them as part of a normal human team. Just happens to be that we've got AI blocks in there. And they're making connections. Now they're making connections that humans can make. They're just making them a lot faster. So, we often talk about, we had a case in India with children dying of renal failure, and the AI was very rapidly able to make the connection between that and cough syrup, and the cough syrup having diethylene glycol in it. Now humans find that and make those connections, but when you've got AI that can just sit there and churn around and put this into it, and we use graphs a lot, we use causal graphs to put knowledge in. One of the big problems with language models is they stop learning the day that you stop training them, and training is expensive. Humans, we go to sleep, we wake up the next day, and we've got our memories of the day before, and we build. We haven't yet really got to that place with language models. So now we look at auxiliary systems to supplement that knowledge in real time, so that we don't have a model that just, became dated the second it stopped training.
And how do you feed humans into the loop, to support the work you're doing in the World Health Organization? Are they helping train the algorithms, or check the insights and escalate them, or what's the kind of human role within the decision making that you're developing within the World Health Organization?
So my philosophy is typically that we want AI to do the dishes and the laundry, so that we can focus on the things that matter, or the things we want to do. So we're looking for clusters. So if I look at MERS, or if I look at cholera, or if I look at any of or Lyme disease, or dengue, if I could show you a map of the world and you could look back in time, you would see these blobs moving around. You see these cluster activities that grow and spread and split and shrink. That's the vision, but to tie all the data together is incredibly time intensive. So we've got the AI mapping things together onto an ontological graph, multidimensional graph. We're connecting those, and then we're constantly mapping them in time and geographical space, trying to tie the clusters together so that we can monitor the clusters. It's just so tedious. It's not tedious for AI because it doesn't have a boredom threshold. So then we can take those results out and give them to the humans, and the humans can go, oh, hang on a minute, dengue just moved even further north in Europe this year. We need to plan for this.
And how do you pick out the needle in the haystack, Jon? Because one of the things you must have seen during COVID, there lots of COVID noise, but actually you still want to pick up the trends in Lyme disease or dengue fever, or maybe unique signals that are coming out. Are those the kind of things that you're training, or the AI is particularly good at? What's your view on that? Weak signals, I guess, that could be significant.
We were pretty lucky about this. It was a call that David had, and they basically had this. They were calling it the infodemic. There was such a deluge of information that it was hard to pick out the small signals. And actually, I think on 2020 or 2021, there's a video of me talking at the Global Technical Meeting about exactly this topic, and it was remote because we were all still under lockdown. But we created the first version of the anomaly detection system that benchmarked everything, and then was really interested in looking at the small signals. Now that's become a lot more complicated. And the latest version of that now goes live this week, actually, just in time for the World Health Assembly next week. And it's anomaly detection, but this is where it's interesting, right? It's not just about anomaly detection, and it's not just about clustering, and you picked it up straight away. It's about both. You need to follow the clusters of information, and you need to pick out the small signals that could become big.
Really interesting. And basically it's doing a human job, as you're articulating, but it's doing it at a speed and with a lower boredom threshold.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, we then put all that information back into humans, so humans don't have to sit there every day and read 2,000 articles for the first thing that they do when they get into work. It's like, these are the things that you really need to look at. And it's so insightful as well. It kind of democratizes the data as well. When you've got one small team just looking at that data, then they have it. And we're not great sharers. We sometimes share, and the World Health Organization is one of the better sharers, but you still have to have mechanisms. When you democratize that data, everybody gets to see it. Everybody gets to see a growing problem and go, do you know what, actually, that's relevant to me too.
And with that example, Jon, I mean, obviously, working and supporting the World Health Organization, and particularly during that time, the whole COVID period. I mean, what an immense amount of responsibility. Do you feel that yourself? Does the team feel that? The pressures of the consequences of the work you're doing?
So massive amount of pride in the team. There are occasions when I kind of, when they're bored and they're fed up and they've been coding all day, and it's actually quite good to remind them what they're working on. And they get it, by the way, and their faces light up and change. It's very difficult when you're stuck in the weeds sometimes to realize what the bigger picture is. And yeah, we're incredibly fortunate and lucky to work on the projects that we do. At the same time, a piece of advice that somebody gave me very early on in business is that you're defined by the business you turn away, not the business that you win. We've turned away. I'm not going to get it. I'm not a person to morally lecture anybody, but we as an organization, for our own reasons, have said there are lots of areas that we won't get involved in. Anything that could lead to torture, we avoid gambling, anything that leads to harm. So we walk away from an awful lot, and we've been lucky enough to pick up business in areas that we are really proud of working in.
Does that give you a huge amount of extra motivation because it's so purpose driven?
It does. I fly out on my own butt to Berlin to work with a guy called Johannes, who's an absolute genius, an epidemiologist. And when it came, there's a big thing, and we don't have enough time to go into it, called the causality knowledge graph. And it's like a knowledge graph, but everything's based on causality rather than based on nodes. And we brainstormed that. And we were trying to get to a point where we could, and it works now. So the Indian renal failure was a case, but we want to pick up loss of smell in COVID as soon as it happens. No, now we all look back in hindsight and we go, oh yeah, loss of smell COVID in the early days, nobody realized that. There was a lot of connections being made, and a lot of those connections were wrong and some of them were right. So we worked together, and Johannes and I worked on, I was at a global technical meeting in Senegal where we worked a lot of this through. But yeah, I will fly out to Berlin on my own buck, on my own dime, just to be able to spend that time with him to pick his brain. And it's, yeah, it is, yeah, we're pretty motivated to do a good job here.
Really good. We're coming to the end now, Jon, but I want to ask you one final question and then give Romesh a chance to finish off. You've talked about your entrepreneurial journey, what you've learned. We've talked about AI, your interpretation of it, which I think is a really good articulation. What's your kind of view to entrepreneurs now playing in the world? What would be your recommendations, and how would you play AI into that if you wanted to?
Okay, this is a huge conversation. Why are startups more successful in the US and the West Coast than they are in the UK? And look at ARM. Every phone has an ARM chip. We created ARM in Cambridge and then we sold it for 40 billion. I was like, and look, Mike, you and I have talked about this as well. We've talked about government procurement departments whose stated aim has been that we will be fast followers. And, I've talked about the fact that, look, if you're going to aim to be second, you're probably going to end up fifth. It is about ambition, but it's also about what enables you to be successful. And we are not as good at nurturing startups in the UK as America is, but we do actually have incredibly innovative people. So accept that there's a barrier there. Accept that for my book, I think that we are better, which is why we often get hired. And I can cite lots of examples of where we've been hired by stateside companies to do the prototypes and the innovation, because we do it incredibly well. Accept that there is going to be a higher bar and just go for it.
Believe in yourself and go for it.
Back yourself, have a safety net, back yourself and have a plan. Like, although I come across as not having a plan, the golden rule is to have a plan to it. It can be a loose plan, but do have a plan.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Jon. Romesh, have you got anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'd just like to say what a rich conversation, Jon. You've come with so many great insights, and thank you so much for sharing them with us. I think what I'm taking away is is really a combination of probably three aspects. I think it's very powerful in combination. So firstly, your technical knowledge, expertise, curiosity, and that desire for innovation is really wonderful to hear about, and you've achieved some amazing things. But the second aspect is that deep understanding of entrepreneurship and the key components that you need to be successful, that will to win, the understanding of cyclicality, the kind of security blankets that you might create for yourself, the understanding of the risk, the meaningful relationships that you've understood are so important. And then finally, you wrap it up so well with your focus on values and real purpose-driven activity. And that combination is just incredible. Yeah. So I thoroughly enjoyed listening to the way you've described your journey, your articulation of those points. And thank you so much for joining us and sharing those insights.
Cool. And I'd just like to say, what an awesome idea for a podcast. And, I hope it does inspire more people to go set up their own companies.
Yeah, that's our objective, I think, Jon. It's challenging, but if you learn from people like yourself, it's achievable and you can do amazing things. So thanks, Jon. I think you and I could do 10-hour podcast on ideas and problems that we'd like to fix, but I think it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on and to learn about your journey. So thank you everyone for listening or watching, and we hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Strive and Thrive is a podcast for entrepreneurs, founders and business leaders. Please like, follow and subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Strive and Thrive.